Hello, everyone, and welcome to Philosophication. This is part 2 of our discussion on the Odyssey. Please go check out part 1 if you haven't done so already. You can find that either on our YouTube channel or whatever podcast app you're using now. Otherwise, enjoy part 2 of our talk.
All right, well, let's talk a little bit more about the Odyssey.
Let's do it.
So, there's this one trope that comes up, and this is when Odysseus is back home. He disguises himself as a beggar, or Athena disguises him as a beggar when he first gets back to Ithaca, and he's doing all this subterfuge and trying to figure out where everybody stands, and before he actually takes on the suitors in battle and takes back his palace. But at one point, he's hanging out around the palace, disguised as a beggar, just kind of begging food off of all the suitors. And Antinous is he's the lead, the most prominent of the suitors. He's getting increasingly hostile towards Odysseus, and he talking down to him. He throws things at him, and at one point, even the other suitors who are the bad people, right? The whole poem wants us to think that they're the bad people. It portrays them as people who break the code of Xenia, and they deserve to die, basically, at the end. So even the bad people eventually think that Antinous is going too far, he's being too much of a dick. So after he throws a footstool at Odysseus, and then one of them says, and I'm going to quote this directly, he says, "Antinous, you did not do well to strike this unlucky vagabond. You will be accursed if he is in fact some god from the high sky. We all know that gods take the form of strangers from other lands, assuming all kinds of shapes and roaming through cities, while they observe the acts of both the violent and of the just." So, apparently, it's a commonly held belief that gods roam around disguised as mortals in order to test the character of people, which is interesting. And this is not this is a common trope throughout mythology. Just know this from knowing other stories, but the Odyssey is not the only place it shows up. It is the first place it shows up, at least the first written surviving record that we have of it showing up. But I was thinking about this, and it's such a common thing to have either a god or a wizard or something, some kind of a powerful being disguised as a stranger, especially a beggar or a vagabond, and going to test the character of people, to see how they react when they don't know that they're talking to a god. And I think it's just because that trope is so common, it seems like it must be saying something. There must be a point to that, otherwise it wouldn't be so common, right? So think about what that means. What does it mean if you hold the belief that any random stranger you come across or who comes to your house could be a god in disguise? It seems like if any random stranger could be a god, you would probably want to treat them respectfully, right? Because it could be a god that's testing your character to see how you treat someone that you think is a beggar. So it's there's a moral to the trope, which is that you should treat strangers with respect, right? Yep. Which is interesting because, especially in a culture like this, remember, this is in a very much an honor culture where reputation is a big deal and standing in your culture is a big deal. But even the lowest of the low, you're supposed to treat with respect. Even some basic level of decency, right? You're not supposed to throw things at them and just be an unnecessary, be a dick to an unnecessary degree. So I think the point is, I kind of think that this is the root. I have a guess anyway. I think that this is the root of the idea of human rights, or like legal rights of the individual in modern Western culture. And so, like, this culture back then, there would have been no. They didn't have a legal concept of human rights back then, right? Like, they didn't even really have a legal system at all. It was just, warlords, fighting amongst each other for power. And if you weren't one of them, you were one of their subjects, right? So it's really interesting that they would have some kind of a moral, like some kind of a societal standard that says you're supposed to treat even the lowest of the low with basic decency. If any random person could be a god in disguise, it's not very far. Like, if you hold that belief already, it's not a very far leap to every human being has a spark of divinity in them, right? And ought to be treated as such. So, is this making any sense?
I mean, I'm waiting for you to tell me the link between the two things. I mean, I'm not saying I don't believe that this is the root of human rights, but I'm not convinced that it's the root of human rights. But you haven't really articulated that. You said it's not a big leap to a spark of divinity in each person. So I do think it's interesting, the whole God in disguise thing. I mean, even though it's Odysseus, not a god, but they talk about how, they think the gods sometimes test them by going around the world of men, dressed as lowly people, and to test people and see how they treat them. Now, I think if you think about it to the person, I think about it in two ways. One, the person writing it, and another way is the person listening to it or hearing it or reading it, right? But I think the person writing it, you got to think, or let's start with the person reading it, right? To them, the audience this was written for was an audience that believed in the Greek, what do you call it? Pantheon, whatever.
Yeah.
They believed in the Greek pantheon. They thought this was real, not just a story. Now, if you put it in that context, and this kind of applies, if you think about it like any other religion, then so many of the stories that you're told in any sort of religious context are in a ways meant to be a shortcut for morality, right? Instead of thinking through and reasoning out what makes the most sense and the best way to live, it's a shortcut. And it's not that people can't think through it and can't figure it out for themselves, but when you're talking to little kids and you're trying to same thing as honor culture, right? Honor culture is it's a shortcut for morality. There's an expectation to behave a certain way, and then later on you can figure out why and if it's the best, but you want the default to behave a certain way. So I think in the same way, in any religious context, stories that's what they're for, So I'm not saying, people who wrote it or, Homer, who wrote it, didn't believe it was true, but like all these stories in a religious context, and not only religious stories, right? You think about, I don't know, any Humpty Dumpty or the Three Blind Mice or, you name it. There's always kind of a moral to it, and it's like a shortcut to morality. So we want little kids listening to the Odyssey back then to learn these standards, the expected way to behave, and then later on they can figure out why it's the best way to behave. So it's interesting. A cynical view is that people wrote this story knowing it was a lie, just to try and instill the value of being hospitable, So you use this story, right? And that's what cynics kind of think of religion in general, is that maybe somebody knew better at the top, maybe not, but that the stories have a purpose, and that's a shortcut for morality. And then,
well, they could they could be a shortcut for morality, or they could be like just an embodiment of what the culture already thought about morality. So like, it's like a chicken or the egg kind of thing. Like,
sure.
Did the story come first, or did the culture's morality come first? And the story had that message put into it because the culture already had that morality.
Oh yeah, I don't think it was invented by the Odyssey. I think it's just a cynical way. Again, this is thinking of people who write it as non-believers, or maybe not even that, because it's a way of inculcating children.
Right.
It's not that it's not inventing a new value. It's a shortcut. Instead of reasoning with children and explaining to them the cause and effect relationship of how you treat people and how it affects the world and all that, you just teach. And this is how we teach children. You know what I mean? And this is how if you're an adult, you're supposed to stop thinking like this. You'll have your bias and defaults because of stuff like this, but then you're supposed to think your way through stuff and why something is morally good or morally correct and why other things are wrong. So, I think it has a lot of value in that aspect to a Greek, to a Greek parent, to a Greek government trying to, instill certain values in their citizens. So, that said, I'm sure most of the people, teaching it also believed it, but I think a lot of parables and stories, even in the Bible, are very similar. People believe it's true, but they also can see the value in it in teaching children or teaching young people, right? Yeah. That it's inculcating values. And, to me, that's a funny coincidence that makes it sound a little too good to be true. But to them, it's just they go hand in hand, right? Like the truth and the convenience of the moral. So, and then I guess to a non-cynic, to someone who actually believes in the gods of the pantheon, they would think the gods did this so that people would learn. You know what I mean? Like they knew the Iliad would be written and the Odyssey, and these are the values that they wanted to instill, and that's part of why these stories even happened in the first place. Why Odysseus was actually turned into a vagabond and sent to his own home. Part of it is like the moral that you learn from the story was deliberate.
Yeah.
By the
gods. I wonder if they did. I actually don't know this. I wonder if people back then did believe all this stuff was literally happened. I don't know if it was mythology to them or, they thought it really happened. I'm sure it was probably mythology to them, I think. Because, you think about the tradition, like this was like an oral tradition where bards would go around and perform this poem for people. And so, every bard could kind of tell the story the way he wanted to,
Right, but people can go around telling stories about Jesus and Moses and you can, but you're preaching to a choir that believes in Jesus and Moses, and I think it would be the same thing back then. I think they believed in the gods. I think we haven't really gotten to it yet. I can't wait to, but eventually we're going to get to Plato and Socrates, and they talk about religion, in the context of their days. And in their days, that was religion.
Yeah.
People believed in the gods. Now, maybe, it's hard to say. I don't know enough about it to know to what extent they took it literally. You know what I mean? But I think they generally weren't atheists or even deists, and they certainly weren't monotheists. So,
yeah.
Anyway,
I guess the point I was trying to make is the moral of that. The moral of this belief that gods go around the world disguised as mortals is that you ought to treat every stranger like they could be a god. And that ties into this hospitality culture too, right? Because, a random stranger shows up at your door. That's part of the incentive system for, people not abusing the Nia.
Yeah.
Like not abusing the rights afforded to them or the quote unquote rights. It's not really a right, but it's, the conventions, not abusing the conventions of Xenia.
Yeah.
So the moral is you ought to treat random strangers like they could be a god in disguise.
Yeah.
Which is to say, treat them, don't throw things at them and treat them like crap. And it seems to me like that could develop into the idea that people have a right to not be treated like crap, or have a right to not be aggressed against.
Mm-hmm.
And it hasn't developed that far yet, because they wouldn't have had a concept of human rights back then, really. But I think this is like the beginning of a concept of human rights, maybe. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'll be interested to see how that develops through, the rest of the tradition.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I find it funny because I hear a lot of people, I don't know, trying to credit like Christianity, for example, for our, for the Enlightenment to a degree, right? Like Ben Shapiro does this. He's convinced that the Enlightenment is, because of Christianity and not in spite of it. And I don't know. I feel like for hundreds and hundreds of years, nothing about Christianity really gave any credence to the rights of the individual, or even the individual mattering very much. It wasn't just a matter of kings and vagabonds. It's like the church, the monks and the priests and the, cardinals and all that had all the power, all the knowledge, and everyone else was just nothing. And that was pretty much the way it was. That was the standard. And it wasn't until now these were religious men, started thinking outside the box. They believed in God. That was like their default, that was their assumption from the beginning. People like, Descartes and people like that, who really started this sort of alternate theory about, the individual and reality and how we relate to, the cosmos or whatever. And I don't know. I think these ideas crop up because of experience, because of human nature, people like getting sick and tired. I don't know, hundreds of years of the Dark Ages, it seemed like a powder keg, you know what I mean? And if it took, 1,000 years of Christian domination and in the Western world before human rights became a thing, then I don't think you can give credit to Christianity, you know what I mean? Because people were more Christian back then. They were the most Christian they've ever been. It's like all there was. The Bible hasn't changed.
Well, I think if you're going to do what he does and credit Christianity with the Enlightenment because of some deep ideas that Christianity has within it, like, I see the point that the Enlightenment didn't just pop up out of thin air. Like, there was a cultural context that it arose in. But if you're going to do that, if you want to put the Enlightenment in its cultural context, go all the way.
Yeah.
Like, because these deep ideas that Christianity has in it about the rights of the individual, or the humans being made in God's image or whatever, those ideas had been around before. Those ideas didn't just pop up out of thin air either. Yeah. And I think we're seeing that here. Like, this is almost another instantiation of humans being created in God's image.
Right.
Like it's almost the same idea. It's like any random stranger could be a god. That's almost like saying humans are created in God's image.
Well, the point of me bringing all this up is that I don't think humans being created in God's image is where natural rights come from. I don't think that they're related. I think, sure, the people that kind of first coined those ideas, natural rights and all that, were Christians, and they probably would have thought of that, that, oh, we're all made in the image of God. But, there's something more to it. When an individual can come up with that all by himself, You know what I mean? And it's not society that's doing it. It's a guy, and there really is a guy. People like John Locke or, Thomas Hobbes and these people who were, for their time, revolutionary with these ideas that we take for granted now. You know what I mean? Society wasn't what did it. I mean, somehow the ideas thrive because they made sense, because of reason, because people suffer and they don't want to suffer anymore. And they read about, and they live through this plight, and they see a guy saying, hey, you matter too, and your rights matter. You know what I mean? I mean, it seems so much more pragmatic than all that. If it makes sense to the masses because the masses are the ones that suffer otherwise. They want human rights when they hear about this idea. You know what I mean? They're not like, well, yeah, the Bible says so that makes sense. The Bible says that we all have to be treated the same. You know what I mean? Well, we all have to be treated with respect and all that because it says we're all made in the image of God. Like, that's not what the church said. That's not how the church treated people. It was when people could finally think for themselves, that this kind of came about. So I don't know. I think it makes so much pragmatic sense. It just, for your own sake, of course, that makes sense. If you've lived in a world where your ancestors and up until you have had just no rights whatsoever, and you hear about this alternative where, hey, maybe you can't just be worked to death, without any pay or with very little pay, or maybe your lords can't just take your wife and impregnate her on your damn wedding night or whatever, you name it. These are all wrongs that people felt, and they're clearly wrong. So the antithesis was just, personal, or human rights. So I don't know. I think they thrived in a world where people became more educated. They learned how to read, and people were allowed to think for themselves, and that's what, because even in the monarchs where this, like in England, which is responsible for a lot of these thinkers that start, these Enlightenment thinkers, not the only ones to be sure, but, some of the early ones, they had the rights of man or whatever you call it, not the rights of man. It basically wasn't a despotic tyranny anymore for like 100 years before that, a couple hundred years before our revolution. Englishmen were allowed to speak and think and talk, and they, like, to a degree, they had free speech, and they had, this ability to pursue all these ideas that, hundreds of years before that were off limits to talk about, think about. You couldn't disseminate it very well to the common people. People were just getting more educated, and they were allowed to think for themselves. So I don't know. And sure, they would call on the Bible because that was the default for everybody, and say, hey, look at this Bible quote says this. Anyway, it's just too pragmatically based. Like, it's too pragmatic. It's based on, like, just suffering versus not suffering. You know what I mean? Of course you choose not suffering. You don't need a book to tell you that. And that book didn't help for the 1,000 years before that, So that's why. So that's where you're losing me, because you're linking. It sounds like you're linking this. Any person might be a god in disguise to people are made in the image of God, and I believe that that's a fair link to make. And so that link might lead you all the way to Ben Shapiro today, saying that people have rights because we're made in the image of God. So it might be true to say that the old Greek philosophy ultimately leads to Ben Shapiro saying something like that. But I think Ben Shapiro saying that is incorrect, and I think that's not where our rights actually came from. So, but as a it's not even really a predecessor, though, if you think about it, to Christianity. To Judaism, which is where this image of God thing comes from, right?
Yeah, it's
probably similar time periods.
Yeah, not exactly predecessor, but in
different parts of the world and similar time period. But that might just go to show that these aren't unique ideas. These are ideas that were pretty common.
Yeah, they're kind of ideas that are developing alongside each other.
Right, and probably there's even other traditions that we don't even know about where that's a thing.
Think about the spread of Christianity. Like, after it became Christianity, it stopped being Judaism and became Christianity. it was like it spread through the Greco-Roman world, right? So
Yeah.
like as far as the Greeks and Romans were concerned, Christianity was a successor to what they already had. Like it had already been developing on its own, at least the Judaism part had been developing on its own, but then they kind of fused, and
Right.
as far as the Greeks and Romans were concerned, Christianity came after. So it's like
Yeah.
they already had this foundation of all of their beliefs, and those aren't just gonna, like, the effects of those beliefs on the culture aren't just going to go away overnight once Christianity comes into the picture.
Yeah, so there's already a foundation on which Christianity can thrive, since people already share a lot of those base values anyway, like treating people with respect and whatnot.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess I see your point about this not being, this apparently wasn't effective in creating natural rights for thousands of years, but I guess, like, back then, think about back in the Greek world. If you had asked any random person if you had given them the concept of human rights and asked if they think that's a good idea, maybe they would have said yes. And but even if you have individuals within the culture thinking that's a good idea, you still have to have a way to get that into the legal system, like the hierarchy of the culture. You know what I mean?
Right.
So, like, even if people think that's a good idea, it's still not going to be law. It's still not going to be embodied into law just because people agree with it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. I could see the seeds that may have ultimately led to natural rights, human rights being there. Because certainly these, in fact, maybe even more so than Christianity, because the Enlightenment philosophers all read, the Odyssey and the Iliad and Socrates and Aristotle. You know what I mean? So,
Right.
And even Ben Shapiro admits that, right? So, and they also, like you say, they didn't have human rights, but a lot of these base concepts about how to treat people, those could be the foundational principles, the first principles on which you build a new ethic that they didn't get to, but it's still the same foundational principle,
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I'm not saying that when individual rights eventually came about, I'm not saying they came about explicitly because of Christian doctrine,
right,
or because of this doctrine. All I'm saying is, when people came up with that idea, eventually, they got their idea. Somebody had that idea, like John Locke had that idea,
right,
and he didn't just pull it out of nowhere. Like, he was also raised in a cultural context, and he read, like you said, he read ancient philosophers, and he got that idea from somewhere, or he at least he fused together a bunch of ideas that he got from somewhere,
yeah,
and came up with that for himself, right?
yeah. Yeah, it may have taken someone like him to be brave enough and ingenuitive enough to come to that conclusion, but yeah, surely a lot of the first principles, he didn't make them up. He got them from ancient traditions.
Right. It's almost like you were saying before about how we teach kids, like, these stories are kind of for the purpose of teaching kids how to be, like, how to behave and how to act. It's almost like that was just the way people thought. Like, people didn't ever and start reasoning for a long time. Like, they just acted according to the morality that they were taught by those stories, like by religious stories, and not perfectly, obviously. Like, people didn't always follow the rules, but it's like, for the longest time, humanity was in its childhood, and then at some point, these ideas and morals that were in those ancient stories eventually someone like John Locke articulated them explicitly, and they worked their way into law.
Right.
And then we had like a reason, like a way to reason through this stuff, using logic instead of just taking our morality from the stories.
Right. Yeah. All right. I think we found some common ground here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So, well, the other thing that actually, this is kind of in the same vein as what we were just talking about, where the morality works its way into stories, right?
Right.
So in book 10 of the Odyssey, this is right after they encounter the Cyclops, and Odysseus loses a bunch of his men. They come away from that island that they were on, and then they come to another island, Aeolia, where they encounter the king Aeolus, who is the keeper of the winds, and he shows them good hospitality, sends them on their way with a gift, and the gift is the 4 winds tied up in a bag, and he gives this to Odysseus. So, and then he sends them along with fair winds, so they speed along home to Ithaca, and they get there very quickly. And this is only I think 2 or 3 years after the war ends, so this is early in Odysseus' journey. So they get back home, they're within sight of Ithaca. Odysseus goes to sleep, and his crew becomes jealous of the gift that he got from Aeolus. They don't know what's in the bag. They think it's treasure or something. And they feel like they haven't gotten enough out of the spoils of war from the Trojan War. They feel like Odysseus has gotten rich, and they haven't gotten their fair share of the spoils of war. So they open the bag, and the 4 winds come out and creates this giant storm that blows them off course and blows them all the way back to Aeolia. So they get back there, and Odysseus goes to the king again and asks for help again. And the king asks why they're back there, and Odysseus tells him, well, my crew made a stupid decision. They opened the bag, and it made this big storm, and now we're back here. So Aeolus tells him, I'm not helping you again. I already helped you once, and clearly the gods don't favor you. So why would I help you? The gods don't favor you. I don't want to get involved with you. So I don't know how much you've listened to Jocko Willink, but this reminds me of his idea of extreme ownership.
Yeah, I'm familiar.
Odysseus is not doing that here. His crew makes this decision, and think about that decision. Like, his crew feels like they haven't gotten their fair share of the spoils of war, and we don't really know if they have or not. Like, it could be that they're justified in their complaint or not. We don't really know from the story, but either way, if their complaint is justified, then Odysseus didn't give them their fair share. Like, he's not taking care of his men. And if their complaint is not justified, then Odysseus hasn't noticed that they're upset, which he's also kind of responsible for as a leader, like to keep tabs on how his crew is doing. So he holds some responsibility for what happened as the leader, and yet he gets back to Aeolia and blames it all on his crew. Like, his crew made a stupid decision, and he doesn't take responsibility for any of it. So he's doing the opposite of extreme ownership. And because of that, Aeolus doesn't help him again. So they go straight from there to another island where they run into this race of this race of giants called the Laestrygonians. And they destroy 11 of Odysseus' 12 ships. So here's another effect of Odysseus not taking responsibility for his mistake. Catastrophe happens. He loses almost all of his ships and almost all of his men. He only has 1 ship left now. So they go from there. They get out of there as quick as they can. They come to Circe's island, and Circe is a witch or some kind of a goddess that lives in a palace on the inside, on the interior of this island, right? Yeah. And so it's really like the nature symbolism is really strong with Circe, which is interesting because there's this whole, in mythology and mythological symbolism, there's this whole chaos versus order, like nature versus civilization kind of balance that goes on. And you need both, because you get too much chaos and it's too chaotic and you die. Or if you get too much order, it's tyranny, and then you also die. Like the culture also dies. So, and go listen to Jordan Peterson if you want more on this, because he goes into a lot of detail on it. But there's like this, the hero archetype in mythology is the one who extracts meaningful order from the chaos. So he goes into chaos and it goes into the unknown and brings back something of value to civilization. And so Circe in the story is like she's the unknown. She's nature, like, and the nature symbolism is strong because she has all these animals that roam around her palace, and they're like people that she's turned into animals. And she's an enemy at first. So, like, and the first thing that happens when they get there is that she turns half of his crew into pigs, right?
Yeah.
And so then Odysseus takes it upon himself to go rescue them. So he's acting out the hero archetype now, right? He's taking responsibility. He's doing the opposite of what he did before. Like, he's not blaming this on somebody else. He's like, I'm the one who needs to go fix this. So he goes alone to see what he can do. And he ends up saving his crew. He gets them turned back into humans, and then Circe becomes an ally after that. Like, she tells them about all the perils they're going to encounter on the rest of their journey, and she gives them instructions on how to avoid all those perils. So
you think, like, as a moral, when he doesn't take responsibility and he's not a good leader, then the results are bad, whether it's directly or indirectly because of that. And then when he does the right thing and he takes responsibility and he takes charge and is a leader, then things work out well. And maybe that in itself is like the moral of the story, or at least that part of the story. Right.
Yeah, that's what I think.
Yeah, I think I'd never really thought about that until you explained it. But yeah, I think it's pretty deep, and I think it makes sense. And I think it also goes to show that even someone like Odysseus, who it seems like, the idea is anyone listening to the story and people at the time, based in the story, would have known Odysseus to be a great warrior, a great man, a great king, and that even someone like that still has plenty to learn. That might also be a good takeaway that was deliberate as well from Homer. You know what I mean? That, it's very clear that change that you're talking about, but yeah, even as great a warrior and leader as Odysseus still has growing to do.
Yeah.
If you like this show, there are many ways you can support it. You can talk about it on your own blog or podcast, you can share it on social media with your friends, or you can leave a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you happen to listen to it. If you're watching on YouTube, you can subscribe to the channel and hit the thumbs up button if you like this video. Thank you for your support, and we'll see you next time on Philosophication.
The views expressed in this show are those of the authors and do not necessarily represent the official policy or position of the Department of Defense, Department of the Navy, or the U.S. government.